And a special welcome to today as we are going to look at the topic of natural disasters. Where is God through all this? And today being a very extended Q&A time. So we're relying on you guys that you're going to participate very much today in the forum. We're going to be hearing in a moment from our two speakers whom I'll introduce, and then it'll be over to you to ask any questions you like. The rules here are very simple. Any question is permissible. You don't have to agree with the speaker's position. Any question is possible. So do feel free to raise your hand. That will be the way we'll do the questions this time. Raise your hand and a microphone will come around to you. It'd be a help if you did keep your questions rather succinct. That way we can get through as much as possible before we close. And we'll close by 10 to the hour. If it's your first time here at the City Bible Forum, a special welcome. It's great that you're here. My name is Peter Caldor. And I'm going to introduce now our two speakers. So would you be able to both come up? So in order, David Cohen and Alan Stewart. Although they're going to get out of order now, but that's fine.
Oh, sorry.
Here we are. Yep, sit down, guys. So on my immediate right here, on your left, is Alan Stewart. Al was a former, or is a bishop, formerly working in Wollongong up till 18 months ago. He's now, as you may know if you've been coming here before, one of our regular speakers. And Al otherwise spends his time in helping others start new churches around Sydney and beyond. And David Cohen comes from University of New South Wales. And I'm just going to refer to the back of your outline to make sure that I get his official title correct. David Cohen,
Empress of India,
is not the former head, he is the current head of the School of Biological, Earth and Environmental Sciences at New South Wales Uni. And members of his team oversee the Australian Tsunami Research Centre and the Natural Hazards Research Laboratory. So you can see why we've invited David to be part of the discussion of natural disasters. Obviously his expertise lends itself directly to this topic. Okay, so the format. I have asked both of these gentlemen to kick us off with a few minutes of their perspective on this topic, and then it'll be over to you to ask whatever questions you like, and I'll sort of indicate who goes next with the questions. So we might hear first from David, and then we'll hear from Alan.
Okay, so I'll set the scientific scenario for earthquakes and tsunamis and similar natural disasters. So we live on a pretty dodgy bit of real estate. We're effectively living on a large conveyor belt. In the oceans, new crust has been created the whole time on these massive ridges which run up and down the middle of the oceans. If you could drain the oceans, you would see these massive mountain ranges running up the middle. That new oceanic crust moves out, and at the other end, it's being destroyed. And the ocean crust goes down underneath continental crust and disappears back into the upper mantle. And in doing so, it generates these large volcanic arcs, of which Indonesia, Japan are very good examples, and the greatest example being the Andes Mountains in South America. In those areas, the slab going down generates volcanoes which kill people through volcanic eruption, ash flows, lahars, mudslides, and noxious gases. There's also one other option where, rather than new crust being created and moving out or being destroyed, you can have two bits of crust going past each other. And the classic example of that is the San Andreas Fault in the southwestern US. If you've got bits of rock going past each other, these are very, very high stress events. We're moving north at 7 centimetres per year. So, you know, you can, in your mind, you can do a quick calculation of the actual velocity of the chairs sitting here at the moment under great stresses. And as these plates move past each other or go under each other, the stresses build up and build up and build up, and eventually the friction is overcome and the plate moves. And at that point, you generate your major earthquakes. But generally, you don't just generate one quake. A big one is typically followed by a whole string of aftershocks And some of those, as we saw with Christchurch, the aftershock was less than the original quake, but generated a lot more damage because of the way in which the energy was transmitted around the crust, and also pointed out that the building codes in New Zealand are inadequate. Heaven help those in San Francisco or in LA, where again we're pretty sure their building codes are not up to the magnitude 9 or 9.5, which is coming. So we can predict where earthquakes occur, roughly. They occur in these massive belts. They run around the Pacific. There are some going through northern Asia into Europe. But we cannot predict easily when they can occur. We generally think if you get big quakes, there's probably a certain amount of time between one quake and the next. But our data sets in most places are not good enough yet to be able to say, oh, well, the quake that's about to destroy San Francisco will occur on Tuesday, the 19th of September at about 4 in the afternoon. It's not that accurate. So this all comes under the Great Plate Tectonics model that geologists hang most of their understanding about how the Earth's crust has evolved. But one other thing the earthquakes generate, depending on the motion, if you get blocks of rock that do this, one going up, one going down, in various combinations in an ocean area, they generate waves. These waves start off as very low amplitude, and in the deep oceans you would not notice that the boat had gone up and down. They're also travelling at about 800 kilometres an hour, so the speed of a jet. When they get near the shore, the waves slow and they mount up, and eventually you get the surge of water, which was so magnificently demonstrated in the Japanese event and some of the horrific but still exhilarating photography that went on with that event. The question of Japan, probably the best prepared country in the world for earthquakes and tsunamis. A highly organised, a very rich country, and still the massive destruction that went on there. The problem for the people in Sendai was they had probably less than 20 minutes warning, even less, because you've got to figure out has the quake occurred and put the warnings out. Insufficient time. The buildings that they built to withstand the earthquakes, the older buildings made of wood, fine for earthquakes, hopeless with a surge of water and mud and trees and rocks and cars going across the landscape. So, can you plan for earthquakes? That's difficult. Can you plan for tsunamis? That's also very difficult. So one thing you might say is don't live on the edge of these plates. Don't live in Indonesia. Don't live in San Francisco. What you should do is you should live in a nice boring area, the centre of a plate, like Australia. Because all we suffer are droughts, fires and floods.
So is this a lecture on real estate?
Yes, that's right. So this is all tips on where not to buy. What not to wear, where not to buy.
Sell New Zealand, buy Australia.
Well, with the Australian dollar, we'll figure that out.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for that perspective. Al, sell New Zealand?
Yeah. Actually, I'm due to go there in July, which would be
Bad timing, I think.
Well, yeah, I'm due to go there and speak in Christchurch, but they still want me to come. So. Most of these events, am I too loud? For most of us, these events come via the media. And it's worth trying to understand, David's the scientist, so I just kind of watch what happens. It's worth trying to understand the effect of the media on us. And that is, the closer something is, the bigger it feels, and the further away it is, the smaller it feels. So the Pakistani floods were massive. It was last year. I understand there's 20 million people, the whole population of Australia, 20 million people involved. And yet the Brisbane floods, which were significantly smaller, I'm not saying they're unimportant, but significantly smaller, feel much bigger because we're so close. And the other thing to take into account is the news cycle. And I try not to let it catch me, but it still does, and maybe it catches you, and that is we get the massive earthquake in Haiti, and that's terrible, and then Christchurch, and then Brisbane, and then Japan, and then the royal wedding, and Osama bin Laden, and then I get today and think, Oh yeah, Japan, that's not over, is it? That's kind of, they're still, and Haiti's not over, and we just kind of, we have an 8-second attention span. And that's, what was I saying? Yeah, that's that's what happens. Now, I was thinking about where I live in the eastern suburbs.
That's a disaster.
And really, it is the safest place you could ever get. We're too far from the coast. I'm at Kingsford, away from Coogee, too far away from the coast to worry about a tsunami. There's no rivers to flood. It would take a bushfire weeks to burn through the city to get to us. And I thought, really, totally safe. And as I was listening to that, there's a 200-tonne 747 just comes over about 50 metres over our house, and they do that dozens of times a week, loaded with petrol people and at several hundred miles an hour, and what could possibly go wrong? So no one's actually... And even in the eastern suburbs in 1999, if you can remember back then, there was a hailstorm that went through the eastern suburbs like no one had ever seen. It missed our house by a block or two. One of my mates was in his house in Kensington with his kids hiding under the table while the hailstones the size of softballs went through the roof and bounced off the table that they were hiding under. So life is fragile. Just 3 observations or thoughts about these natural disasters, things that have happened. One is how we respond naturally with compassion. It's not an academic question, it's people's lives, and the media brings that into our homes, our lounge rooms and so on. It's hard to know, David may be able to tell us, it's hard to know whether natural disasters are getting more common. I suspect it's just the planet is getting smaller because of the media. And so we hear about things, immediately they happen, and we see the tsunami in Japan. We see it happening live as it happens. And I think, I don't want to be too kind of soft, I don't want to be cynical, but I think we actually suffer from compassion fatigue. And that is, I watched 24-hour news coverage of the Brisbane floods and I'm feeling terrible, and Kathy and I gave money to that, but the Pakistan floods were last year and they were terrible, and now we've got Japan, and then there's been hurricanes in the USA in the last little while and 300 people killed, and I think there was an earthquake overnight somewhere. You just can't cope with it all, or you've got to switch off. And the media does that. I'll tell you what they do. Massive tsunami in Japan, nuclear reactor bleeding, etc., and we finish with a dog riding a surfboard at Bondi. It's just kind of the fluffy dog story's always there. So compassion is real and yet hard to keep in context. The second thing is, I think it threatens our comfort zone. Why? Because as rich city dwellers, we're used to having nature under control. So massive floods, Cyclone Yasi hits Queensland. In terms of food, the only thing I notice is bananas are now $12 a kilo. I eat oranges instead. It just doesn't... Food is under control, I expect. Water. We've just had a massive 8-year drought with the El Nino effect. The biggest impact on me, I wasn't allowed to hose my car. We build a desalination plant and then the next year it gets flooded. So it's... food, water. What about geography? Well, geography's under control. You get in a plane or you Skype it. That's under control. It's winter time, you turn on the heater. It's summertime, we turn on the air conditioner. And then all of a sudden, one of these things happens and it shows us we're not in control. And you look back through history, there have been events regularly occurring, the further back you look, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, swept away. And I think it challenges us about the fragility of life. And the third thing, it's worth thinking and letting this challenge our belief system. If I could say politely, I think for the atheist who says, well, there's no God, there's nothing, there's just what is, well, you say, well, look, just you know what happens, well, there it is. And I'd want to say yes, but why is it impossible to live out the implications of that in the sense that it doesn't matter, it's all meaningless, it's just random? Why do we get emotionally involved? Why do we feel like it's wrong? It's so hard to live out the atheist worldview. However, I've got to be honest, for the Christian worldview, it's even more of a challenge, because if God is in control and God is all good, why do these things happen? And you don't want glib, cliched answers. If God is good, God is in control, why do these things happen?
Okay. Well, thank you both, David and Al. That's sort of opened the topic for us, seeing perhaps a little bit more of the science, why these things are happening, and some reflections on how people have responded. Over to you. So we've got a couple of mics floating around the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand. I've got a question, Russ, down the front. Second row, third row.
I want to throw something completely different into the mix. Concerning volcanoes, which we haven't discussed. As I understand it, volcanoes are essential for recycling essential minerals, and it would be logical to assume that God created that situation so that he could sustain life on this planet. And I was wondering if there was, seeing we're talking about where is God in all this, where is he in this event?
So I assume that's a question for David.
Yes, so the fact that the Europeans arrived in Australia and started using European farming methods, and it took a few hundred years to realise the soils cannot support that intensity of agriculture. If you go to areas where the younger geology, and especially with volcanic areas, the soils do have that richness that allows the high density of population. So I think the point you've raised is the conditions that have generated the crust on the planet that allowed eventually a human life to evolve in the whole scheme is the same planet that also throws up the volcanic eruptions, the tsunamis. And one thing I didn't mention was meteorites, that not even on the planet, and that's one flash in your ash territory.
Great. Other questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess the question is are these difficulties and pain built into the world, or has it been put onto it later? Okay. People read the book of Genesis in different ways. So God explains the creation as God makes the world and it is good, I think meaning good for his purposes, and then he creates a garden and puts the man and the woman into the garden. Now there's different opinions about whether was the planet perfect as it should be everywhere, or was it only within the garden? Were there difficulties and heartaches and dangers and so on outside the garden? Not sure. Not sure. But what you may see is that it's since we have walked away from God, these things have become much worse, and these things have actually become life-threatening. And I believe that since we've walked away from God, not only is the planet less friendly, but we are less able to cope with things. Interesting, Tim Keller, the American preacher, says he thinks part of the reason there is so much loss of life in different natural disasters is because those who live in poverty have to live in places that are dangerous. And it is a function of wealth and poverty why poor people are more likely to die in these things. Although not universally.
Yeah. I mean, maybe whilst people are thinking of a question, just to follow on that from Al, but directed to David, have people in any way contributed to natural disasters?
So I guess that there are the two dimensions, that there is the physics of it, and there's very little that we can do to alter the Earth on that scale of things. We're sort of under a bit of an illusion that we are in control of events. We are not, and Japan was a wonderful example that despite the best preparation, how many 20,000 died, some in villages or entire valleys have been completely wiped out. But the other aspect of the disaster is the events that follow, and whether you can limit the loss of life and the rest. And as Al's pointed out, when the disasters occurred in Queensland, the response was very good. In fact, the Premier probably did such a good job of it, she may have got herself another term. In Indonesia, the death toll there and the inability, and from some other countries, the slight reluctance to respond to them led to death tolls in the hundreds of thousands. Just about their entire aquaculture industry was wiped out. And for us, it's not just the opportunity to get year-round prawns and other fish. For them, it is their livelihood. It is their life. And so part of the disaster, as Al's pointed out, was the way in which we responded to it. And what does that say about the human condition and our treatment of each other?
Yeah, thank you. Question here at the front, and then maybe one in the middle. Just take the question here at the front.
Question for David, and Al kind of alluded to this, in terms of the frequency of natural disasters. They do seem to be happening kind of on a more regular basis, or certainly they are reported on a more regular basis. Are there any facts or statistics that kind of indicate that there are greater natural disasters now than, say, 50 or 100 years ago? And then perhaps a follow-up question for Al. I mean, the Bible's quite clear that it talks about there'll be earthquakes and natural disasters, and that's kind of part of like the birth pains, if you like. Just would he like to comment on that, please?
The geologically related events are very chaotic systems. There'll be ebbs and flows, and it may very well be that you've got periods of time where there's a tiny bit more plate movement than at other times. So it is quite likely that the frequency of events like earthquakes, it's not regular, but you may be able to get small bursts. Normally we would hope in our life to score 1 magnitude 9 quake, and we've scored 2 in our lifetimes, or those extend back to Chile, 3 in our lifetime. I guess the question about climate change does now come into it. I think the evidence is fairly strong that humans are exerting an influence. Will that have a series of feedback mechanisms that generates additional disasters related to things like floods and famines? And I think there is a possibility of that. So in part we have contributed unwittingly to our own difficult circumstances.
Thank you. In the middle.
Sorry.
Yeah.
In terms of what does the Bible say about is the end nigh? New Testament writers would say yes, but the end's been nigh for 2,000 years. It says for God 1,000 years are like a day, and a day like 1,000 years from an eternal perspective. So it's been a weekend since Jesus was here. Jesus taught that the time between his going back to be with God and his return would be a time of wars, rumours of wars, famine, earthquake, and so on. It would happen. The book of Revelation paints that picture as well of natural disasters, of terrible things that will happen, of the way that governments will rise and treat people, and so on. And so I think as you look back, each century since then has actually thought, well, the end must be near because those signs are here. That I don't think this is any... Jesus said you will not know the day when the end comes. I don't think this is a particular sign that, it's going to be next week. But it could be.
Thank you.
I think I've got a couple of questions, but one question is what would be the life lost regarding natural incidences and those which were done by man through wars and the like?
I think the events at the start of the last century were interesting. So the First World War wiped out, about 6 million? Something of that ilk. The Spanish influenza epidemic, which occurred a couple of years after the First World War, wiped out over 20 million. So, humans are really attempting to wipe ourselves out, but natural events are at times exceeding what even we're trying to do.
My other question too is, I know like in Genesis it said that if you eat the fruit, saying to Adam and Eve, dying you will die. Are these signs of that curse that was the result of our disobedience?
Al?
I just thought David might want to jump in on that. It's a good question. Yeah, how do you explain the problems with our world? The Bible would go right back to the book of Genesis, where Adam and Eve, representing humanity, are told that if you disobey God, and the fruit, it's not an apple, the fruit, and it's not having sex, because he just told them to do that, right, and multiply. And the fruit stands for actually disobeying God, for refusing to believe that God is good and wise and making up your own mind. And Adam and Eve are told, if you do that, the day that you do it, you'll die. And so they do that, they walk away from God, and they're, if you like, symbolically, they're sent from the presence of God, sent out of the garden. And it said they die spiritually because they're separated from God, and physical death follows inevitably. And so God also says to them, well, the ground will bring forth thorns and thistles now. By the sweat of your brow you'll raise and you'll feed yourself, and so on. And the Bible talks about our world being put under frustration by God. It's like these are our world groaning. C.S. Lewis talked about God whispers in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, and shouts at us in our pain. It's his megaphone to a deaf world. And so these things that happen are indications that our world is out of step with God. And if you like, it's almost the severe mercy of God saying, listen, there is something fundamentally wrong here. You've walked away.
Could one say then those that are suffering under these natural disasters are explicitly being judged, or is this...
One could say that, but one would be wrong.
Okay. So why would you...
quoting the Bible.
Why?
Because you cannot read suffering or events as simply cause and effect in terms of being morally deserved. In Luke chapter 13, Jesus explicitly says... there was a tower that had fallen on people. He said, do not think that those who died when the tower fell were any worse than anyone else in Jerusalem. Okay? Or Jesus said in John chapter 9, they asked Jesus about a man born blind, and the disciples say, why was this man born blind? Was it his fault or his parents? Jesus says neither. So you can't necessarily yet... Now, why do these things happen? Sometimes we just don't know.
Okay.
Right? There are occasions in the Bible when God explicitly sends some kind of natural disaster because of the wrong things people have done. But you cannot read that unless you are specifically told by God.
Yeah.
So Japan, no worse, no different than Sydney. I think just God hasn't done it here.
Bad real estate. Yeah. Okay, we've got one at the front and then one at the back.
Just picking up on what Alan was saying earlier, general suffering and the problem of evil has been described as the greatest proof for the non-existence of God. However, we learn that people react differently to natural disasters and horrific suffering. Some people discover God in a profound way in the most horrific circumstances. Others, it seems, become more angry, more isolated, more whatever. Have you got any comment about this whole issue of how we respond and the implications of that?
That is true. That what the Bible says is that knowing God and that He is good and wise and has a reason for what comes will profoundly affect the way that you respond to suffering. And so I know people who follow Jesus, who trust Him, and yet are suffering, have difficulty. And yet they are able to understand that God has His reasons for this, that He will mould their character and change them and so on. There are other people who, will respond to difficulties and suffering and it will harden them, make them cynical, that kind of thing. I'm just saying you can't... Even there's many examples in the Bible where those who did trust God still had no idea why things had happened, and they just squealed and asked God why. That's what the book of Job is all about. So deciding to follow Jesus doesn't exclude you from suffering.
Okay. Question at the back.
Yeah, hi. Just a question for David in terms of your scientific explanation of the, the tectonic plates, the movement. Is it just part of the natural order of creation, like the rebalancing of the Earth's atmosphere, or regeneration of the Earth? Can you explain what happens with the movement of plates?
But my understanding would be that God had a purpose to create a planet in which it had certain physical characteristics, one of which is that the outer crust is a series of plates that move around, and we're not the only planet on which that occurs. There are good indications that Mars has the same construction that we do, which of course does pose the question, well, if that's another similar characteristic, do we expect to find life on Mars? And I've actually got another research group that looks at that question, so we try to answer every question that's thrown up. So it's just part of the characteristic of the Earth, which has given the Earth certain characteristics, one of which, and you can link probably to plate tectonics, the situation in which we as a species could evolve. So it was in God's plan that under this structure that eventually, come May of this year, we would all be sitting here for some purpose.
Russ, are you waving or you've got another question?
Oh, this one's more for Al, who said, I think he said earlier that some of the poorest people in the world live in places where natural disasters happen a lot. Why do you think then so many, like one of the richest communities being in LA, live on one of the most active fault lines in the world?
I understand that. I cannot answer that one. I just meant that, for example, in Bangladesh and other places that are low-lying areas that are regularly flooded and so on, it's people who can't afford to live anywhere else. That it doesn't hold universally. So, for example, in the Victorian Alps and the bushfires there, many of the people that lost their homes and lives tragically were there because they wanted to live the green lifestyle. I'm not being critical, I'm just saying they had the money to move out, do the tree change thing, and they were kind of caught in it. So it doesn't hold universally, but I think Tim Keller has a good point there where he says it's people are living in areas where their life expectancies are shorter, they face more difficulties because they don't have the money or the choice to live elsewhere. But LA, who knows?
Well, I guess people started to populate that region before the risks were understood, and of course, by the time that you understood the risks, you're locked into the real estate. So, but I'm sorry, if you've spent time in San Francisco, it's a beautiful area. So people are balancing the risks. Okay, we accept a 1 in X chance of death to live in a beautiful area. I mean, we three crazies do long distance running events with the knowledge that one day we'll drop dead from a heart attack. So humans are wonderful at balancing up this risk game. And those of us from the slightly more cowboy end of the universe will tolerate a much higher risk. And I have to say, if something befalls me on the next heli skiing trip, I'm not going to blame God. It's completely my own fault. I shouldn't have gone down that ravine.
Very good. We had a question a moment ago about how we respond to natural disasters. I think one thing that's occurred to me is that the default response you seem to see in the papers is that Mother Nature is at fault. Mother Nature is angry. I was just in the lift the other day and 3 ladies walked into the lift and they were discussing about how angry Mother Nature has been lately. How do we understand those comments?
I suspect there's a range of background, what people mean by that. At one end, there are those people who kind of are the almost pantheists, and that's making a bit of a comeback lately. The idea that the whole world is one unified spirit, that God is, that we're all part of God. That's the kind of the Gaia idea. And so I think that it resonates because there's that feeling that we are actually meant to be here. This is home, we kind of belong. And so that's the idea of it's personifying that spiritual idea. At another level, it's just a way of talking about nature. It's just a metaphor. So I think there's a range of ideas behind it. But I think there's that spiritual feeling of we're somehow meant to be here, and there's more going on than just hot and cold pressure systems or high and low pressure systems and tectonic plates. Yeah. So I think that's what's behind it. But interesting that people personify nature. You still are looking for someone behind this.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps time for one more question from the floor before we start to wrap things up. One down the front, Caroline.
I was just wondering if the structural changes following a global flood, if you believe in a global flood, would mean that there was more likelihood of a lot of the plate tectonic type disaster events occurring. We don't know too much, I guess, about what happened very, very, very early in history, like earthquakes and tsunamis, etc. But any comment on that?
In fact, I'm just having appointed a new person at the staff who works on deep time issues. So, you know, if a rock is younger than 3 billion years, he won't touch it. It's just, he doesn't like dealing with modern type things. The indications are the Earth does not, it does go through certain cycles, but there is a certain vector to the planet. The crust has evolved, and it continues to evolve and develop. The continents over time have got bigger and bigger and bigger. So the Earth does have a tiny bit of a one-directional characteristic to it. But all the indications are, and all the models would say that things like tsunamis, earthquakes have gone on for the last 4+ billion years. So the question as to whether, say, a Noachian flood could alter the structure of things. Interesting, there's been a bit of work, and there was a Noah's flood, but it was restricted probably to the Black Sea, and it was to do with the end of the last ice age and waters moving around, but a very localised event, but would have been absolutely terrifying for those who lived in the Black Sea at the time.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We are going to have to slowly wrap things up. David is off to New Zealand tomorrow, and he will be part of that, visiting Christchurch.
Well, it's out of earthquake season, so we'll be safe.
Right, okay. And I understand your school is engaged in helping with disaster recovery. That's part of the work that you guys do. So great that you could be with us today. Please join me in thanking our speakers.